Our next speaker is Jake Vander Zanden. So we're continuing on with the Wisconsin Cheesehead theme that we started on Tuesday. Jake is originally from northern Wisconsin, but then he had the good sense to move to Canada for his BSc and PhD, which he got from McGill University. He did a postdoc at University of California, Davis, with both Charles Goldman and Gary Polis. He's been at the Center for Limnology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison since 2001, and he works on a wide diversity of topics, including giant Mongolian trout, invasive species, non-point source pollution, benthic ecology, and then today he's going to be talking about cross-habitat linkages, so looking at benthic, pelagic, and terrestrial linkages in lakes. So join me in welcoming Jake Vander Zanden.
All right, well, thank you very much, Shelley. Let's check out our AV situation here. Okay, yeah, I'm going to be talking about cross-habitat linkages and a coupling of benthic, pelagic, and terrestrial habitats. I want to start off by just acknowledging a variety of co-authors and collaborators who've been involved in this work over the years. First, Yvonne Vadebunker, who's at Wright State University, and Claudio Graton, who's an entomologist at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Those are the two major collaborators. But the second part of this talk that focuses on these aquatic-terrestrial linkages really involves a wide range of collaborators across multiple disciplines, mostly terrestrial ecologists. And so I just want to note the work of David Hookman and Jamin Dreyer and Randy Jackson, Tony Ives, Phil Townsend, all from University of Wisconsin, and Arnie Einarson from University of Iceland. So this work that I'll talk about really represents the collaboration amongst this big group of people, and it's a pretty wide range of disciplines represented here. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation for support for kind of both aspects of the work that I'll be discussing today. So I'd like to start by just noting the social and cultural importance of lakes. And for me, the first thing that came to mind was the UW-Madison Memorial Union Terrace. So this is just a couple hundred meters from my office at the Center for Limnology. And it's a place where during a summer evening, thousands of people are there having a beer and engaging in collegial interaction. So it's a wonderful place. It's a great place to actually consider the fact that humans like to congregate near that land-water ecotone, and you can consider that while you are engaging in that process on the Memorial Union Terrace, having beer. And the same thing happens, I think, on the aquatic side. And aquatic life also congregates near that land-water ecotone, and that's, I think, part of what I want to talk about today. And so, in light of that, there are going to be two main areas of my talk. The first is really going to focus on that littoral zone, that edge habitat at that land-water ecotone. And I want to talk about the benthic productivity from the littoral zone and its importance within the context of the whole lake ecosystem. And then I'll move on to talk about benthic productivity in lakes as a potential connector to the surrounding terrestrial landscape. So I want to talk about coupling in a couple of different ways here. So traditionally in limnology, we have been, in limnology, people who study lakes, we have been highly pelagiocentric. So, for example, when I have my students in my limnology class, and the first day of class we want to learn about sampling lakes, what we do is we get in our boat and we head out to the middle of the lake. This is perhaps overkill, but I don't know. Sorry about the warships, it was all I could find. And we head out to the middle of the lake and we collect samples, presumably uninfluenced by the littoral zone, these shallow water areas, and we measure nutrients and we look at phytoplankton and zooplankton. And that's traditionally what limnologists have done. Similarly, when we think about the food chain in lake ecosystems, often the first thing that comes to mind is phytoplankton and zooplankton and the various critters that feed on those pelagic offshore critters. So we think about the pelagic food chain first and foremost. But in fact, if we spend some time near that littoral zone edge, and many of us do, if you're going to go swimming in a lake, chances are you're going to be swimming in these inshore shallow water habitats. What you see is an area where there's a tremendous amount of activity. There's a high degree of species diversity. There's a lot of habitat heterogeneity, both in terms of the substrate. You have fallen trees. You also have a high degree of primary productivity happening on these bottom surfaces. So when you look at this picture, you see there's kind of a green layer of scum covering the bottom of everything. And in fact, that green layer of scum, periphyton, or attached to algae, is quite important in lake ecosystems. It is the basis for support for many aquatic insects that live in aquatic ecosystems. And those are really important food sources for fish and ultimately provide the basis for trophic production in lake ecosystems, at least in part. So it's just important to acknowledge that the bottom surfaces in these lake ecosystems in shallow depths where light hits the bottom are covered in green scum, and that's really important to higher trophic levels. Well, just to highlight this point that I had made, that limnologists who study lakes have focused primarily on pelagic processes, myself and some co-authors did a kind of a literature synthesis looking back upon publication over the course of a decade and asked, what are people actually studying when people publish some data on primary producers or bacteria or invertebrates in lakes? What habitats are they actually looking at? So this is from a number of years ago, but on the left we have the number of studies that did their measurements in pelagic. In the middle we have a number of studies that did measurements in benthic, and on the right studies that did so in both habitats. We have primary producers, bacteria, and invertebrates represented here. And just note that for all of these taxonomic groups, the vast majority of the emphasis in terms of limnologists going out there making measurements has been in the pelagic zone. So again, just highlighting the point that we have been highly pelagiocentric in the way that we view lake ecosystems historically in the field of limnology. Well, how important is benthos to an ecosystem? There's several different ways of estimating this, and there's not consensus on how to go out and characterize benthic importance. But one way is simply to estimate the contribution of benthic primary production to whole lake primary production. So you could think of that as a fraction. What fraction of all the primary production in the lake is happening in the benthos? And this is estimates of that for 75 lakes from around the world. Along the y-axis, we have benthic fraction of whole lake primary production. So up here means that benthic is really important and comprises almost all of the primary production in the system. And down here means that benthic is not at all an important contributor to primary production. And then along the x-axis, we have lakes classified by different depth classes. So these shallow lakes also tend to be small lakes because small lakes tend to be shallow. These deeper lakes tend to be larger. And what we see is that the importance of benthic primary productivity at the whole lake level scales pretty strongly with lake size. There's quite a bit of variability. So shallow lakes can have a really low or really high importance of benthic primary productivity depending on nutrients and water clarity. But overall, we see this downward trend, but noting the high degree of variability in these small lakes. Large lakes, deep lakes, tend to have very small contributions of benthic habitats to whole lake primary production. And that makes sense because if you think of a large lake like Lake Superior, a very small fraction of that lake is actually the littoral zone. And even though the primary production rate out in the pelagic could be low, there's just so much pelagic volume relative to littoral surface area. Well, there are other ways to think about the importance of benthos in lake ecosystems. And I tend to view the world through a fish-based lens. So what we can do is use fish as integrators of what's happening out in lake ecosystems. And we can use carbon isotopes to estimate for the overall fish community what fraction of the carbon they consume comes from benthic pathways. So what this graph shows, again, is somewhat similar to what we saw in the previous graph. Along the x-axis, the y-axis is the importance of benthic pathways to the overall fish community as estimated using carbon isotopes. Up here means that it's all about the benthos. Down here means that benthos are quite unimportant to higher trophic levels. And what we find is that overall, across this lake size gradient, benthic pathways are pretty important. On average, it's over 50%. And if you're in small, shallow lakes, it tends to be over 50%. Even when we move up into these large, deep lakes, despite the fact that benthic primary production is not very important, it still tends to be pretty important in supporting the fish communities in these lake ecosystems. Now note that the data here, it's just the average of all the fish that are out there. Those fish species are not weighted for their contribution to whole lake fish production. That would be almost impossible to do for a set of 75 lakes. But the important thing to note here is that overall we don't see a coupling here or a trend here with lake size and depth when we take a fisheye view of benthic production. But we do see pretty strong trend with lake size and depth when we view the world through the primary producer lens. All right, so just to summarize this first part of the talk having to do with benthic within the lake ecosystem, I hope the pelagiocentric view of limnology is over, rest in peace. We're recognizing that terrestrial carbon sources support trophic pathways in lake ecosystems, and there are a variety of other things besides just that kind of offshore phytoplankton-based food chain that are really important in determining the structure and function of lakes. And benthic primary productivity, even though it happens in this, oftentimes this tiny little rim around the edge of the lake, it can be really important in supporting higher trophic levels. And it's important to note that a lot of the species diversity in lakes is concentrated around this littoral edge habitat. Okay, so now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about benthic productivity as a vector for connecting lakes to the surrounding landscape. Ecologists and limnologists ecologists have long been interested in lakes because it was thought early on that they were somewhat isolated systems. And here's a quote from Forbes in his classic study, The Lake as a Microcosm, that notes that animals in bodies of water, that is lakes, are remarkably isolated, connected amongst themselves, but not really connected to the things happening in the outside world. In some ways, that's true. And fish aren't often swimming around from one lake to another if these lakes are isolated. But as time went on, this was the 1800s. As time went on, ecologists quickly realized that lakes and the surrounding landscape are very closely connected. And the problem of lake eutrophication, which really came to light in the 1960s, was clearly linked to nutrient inputs from the surrounding terrestrial landscape. And so when we see large algal blooms in lake ecosystems like this and note all the problems that are resulting as a consequence of such algal blooms, we recognize now that this is a result of things that are happening in the surrounding terrestrial landscape. And in fact, there are now a lot of other aquatic terrestrial linkages that are widely recognized, and there are diverse connections that are happening across the land-water ecotone. For example, leaves fall into aquatic ecosystems and they're consumed by aquatic consumers. Insects emerge from aquatic systems and are consumed by birds and bats. And terrestrial invertebrates fall into lakes and streams and are consumed by critters as well. Our understanding of this is almost exclusively based on river and stream ecosystems. And I noted that in the aquatic terrestrial linkage sections that were here at this conference so far, if you go through and look at the talks, almost all of them are about stream ecosystems. A handful of them had something to do with lakes. So our understanding is based on the fact that there have been some really interesting research programs that have focused on these food web connections across this habitat ecotone. Work by Nakano and Mary Power and Kurt Fausch has really pushed forward our understanding of how food webs connect across this habitat. Very little is known about lake ecosystems, and that brought us to our current study area, which is in northeastern Iceland up here, fortunately out of the way of our recent volcano, which has been causing so much problems and stranding people all around the world. And specifically, we've been interested in studying Lake Myvatn, which is in that region. And we believe this to be a low ppCp area, but we're not sure, so we'll look into that. But not a lot of people. So we think that we're probably uninfluenced by such factors. It's a shallow lake, about 4 meters as a maximum depth. It's actually naturally rich in nutrients, so there's inputs of nitrogen, phosphorus, and silica from the surrounding watershed, but there's very little anthropogenic influence. Primary productivity in the pelagic and benthic are high. And this work is really the result of an interdisciplinary team that's led by Claudio Grattan, who's a terrestrial ecologist. Now here's a painting of Lake Myvatn from the 1800s. First thing to note is how many birds there are and what diversity there is there. So it's a fantastic place for birds. Notice that these birds all have these nests as well. So maybe it's a bit unrealistic, but everywhere you look there's a bird sitting on a nest in this painting. Also note these little speckles over here off to the right side of this image. What are those? Mývatn translates in Icelandic as Midge Lake. And if you were to go out and do a core sample from anywhere in the middle of the lake, estimate midge densities, and a good year you'll see densities of about 100,000 midges per meter square. 80% of those are a single species, Tanny-tarsus. So they all come out of the lake in one gigantic emergence event. So what does Lake Myvatn look like? Well, there's the Tanny-tarsus adult. So if you go visit Lake Myvatn at the right time of the year, this is what it looks like. When I showed these pictures to my mom, the first thing she said was, "That's disgusting." So I just thought this was the coolest thing in the world to have so many insects. But anyway, so this is what it looks like during a hatch. And the insects, the midges, come overland. They form these gigantic mating swarms that create these enormous columns. You can see them across the lake. And it looks like big clouds of smoke coming off the land. So they come over land, they have their mating swarms, the males die on land, the females go back to the water and lay the eggs. If you're on land and you just kind of get down on the ground, you see the footprint of midges everywhere. They're caught in spider webs, they're crawling all over the vegetation. Just in case people are uncertain whether there are a lot of midges there. They fall back on land, they fall back on the water. We put out collectors underwater to see if the midges were falling back down to the bottom of the lake. We didn't find any. It was pretty remarkable how few of these midges that fall back to the surface end up sinking down to the bottom. But what we do see is huge numbers of midges washing up on shore. So there's this beach rack of dead midges on the lake, and those midges are colonized by these tiny columbella, which are detritivores. So I didn't show that one to my mom. Okay, so our research questions are, what's the flux of midges to the terrestrial ecosystem? First off, we wanted to kind of answer this basic ecosystem question of how much carbon is moving from the lake to the land. The second is, what does this mean for the terrestrial ecosystems? Does it affect terrestrial food webs? What are the implications for a whole variety of things that a terrestrial ecologist would care about? And then finally, what are the general patterns of aquatic-terrestrial linkages? We recognize that Lake Myvatn is not your average lake. It probably has a few more insects than most other places. So here's kind of the terrestrial food. I'm kind of getting us away from aquatic systems. Now aquatic systems simply produce little bundles of carbon and nitrogen that fly around, end up landing on the terrestrial ecosystem, and the terrestrial ecologists view it simply as a bundle of nutrients. So the terrestrial ecosystem can be thought of as, well, in a simplified way, we have plants, we have herbivores, we have predators such as spiders that generally would feed on these herbivores, and then the plants die and are fed upon by detritivores. Well, in this system, what we're doing is we add midges. Closer we are to the lake, the more midges we're adding to this system, and it's quite possible there could be a variety of implications for the terrestrial food web. For example, more midges could mean increase in predators, and there could be then increased or subsidized top-down control in this terrestrial food web. And there's a variety of different food web interactions that could be the outcome of this addition of midges to this terrestrial system. How do we study these things? Well, we have emergence traps that we put out. So there's Claudia with one of our early prototypes of our emergence traps. And they sit underwater. It's really windy, and Lake Myvatn is a pretty large lake. It's 38 square kilometers. So we don't have them on the surface. We actually have them underwater, which works really well. We also measure midges on land using infall traps. So here you see an infall trap in close proximity to Lake Myvatn. We have them all around the lake. We have them all around other lakes that have lower levels of midges, and then we have them around lakes that don't have hardly any midges at all, and then we have them at varying distances from the lake shore. And if you're near Lake Myvatn, your infall traps get absolutely jam-packed with dead midges after just a couple of days. We estimated midge infall at Lake Myvatn using a combination of the emergence data and the infall data, and we estimated that in 2008 and 2009, 30 to 55 metric tons of midges were deposited to the surrounding landscape per year. So there's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon being added to that surrounding terrestrial system. We see this negative exponential pattern as a function of distance from the lake shore. So really near the lake, you see really large amounts of deposition. As we move to 200, 300, 400 meters from the lake shore, we see much less input. So what does this mean for the surrounding terrestrial ecosystem? Well, these are some results from Landsat images. This is work done by Phil Townsend, who is a remote sensing specialist. And what this shows is the values for a normalized difference vegetation index and how that changes as a function of distance from Lake Myvatn. So as we're at the shore, we see a value that's quite high. It drops off dramatically as we move away from shore. And once we get to be about 500 meters from the shore, the NVDI value is similar to background. Okay, so there appears to be a spectral signature that's picked up using Landsat images, and now I can show you the image. Here's Lake Myvatn, and note this ring of bright red around the perimeter of the lake. So that's basically the fertilizing effect of midges to the surrounding terrestrial ecosystem. The local herders call the grass near Lake Myvatn midge grass, meagrass. So I think that was notable. The herder, or the local people who raise animals, are very aware of the fact that the midges fertilize the grass. So here we have some evidence of this from a Landsat image. And here are just some examples of non-midge lakes where you see no real trend in the spectral image as you move from shore away. And I should also note that all of the fertilized pasture areas were removed from that analysis. Well, what's driving this difference in vegetation, or at least this NDVI, which is an indicator of overall productivity? Well, there do seem to be some trends with the plant community as a function of midge infall. So places that have high rates of midge infall tend to have higher biomass of flowering plants, higher biomasses of woody vegetation, and lower biomasses of heathland vegetation. So it might not be that the same old plants that are there in places that are fertilized by midges are just more productive. We actually see a different vegetation community in the places where midges are being deposited. And that makes sense because in Arctic boreal tundra ecosystems, if you add fertilizer, you tend to shift the plant community from heathland vegetation more towards flowering plants. There were some implications for arthropod abundance as well as a function of midge infall. So the more midges being deposited on the system, the more overall terrestrial arthropods there were. So adding these midges tends to fertilize the terrestrial insect food web. And if we just look at individual taxonomic groups, some groups showed a significant increase as a function of midge infall, and some didn't. So just noting that some of these terrestrial groups were significantly higher in places where there were midge infall, and that tended to be taxa that were detritivores, and so they benefit quite a bit from the fact that all these dead midges are falling into their environment. Well, what about food webs? We were fortunate in being able to use carbon isotopes as a tracer of this aquatic productivity to the surrounding terrestrial landscape. The source carbon isotope values differ dramatically between plants, which are generally at about minus 27. We have C3 plants in the surrounding area, and midges coming out of Lake Myvatn, which are around minus 10 to minus 12 on average. So because consumers pick up the carbon signature of their food, we can use this as a tracer of carbon source supporting the terrestrial consumers. So here's an example of the terrestrial food web for a low midge lake. So note that the mites, collembola, spiders, harvestmen are all centered around minus 25, indicating that, they might be getting some carbon from midges, but for the most part, their carbon signature is centered on that classic terrestrial signature. And now let's look at that food web for Lake Myvatn, right next to Lake Myvatn. We see a dramatic shift in terms of where they're getting their carbon from. So spiders, harvestmen, collembola, mites are showing a very strong midge signal. So just to show that contrast again, here's a low midge system. Midge signature is over here, and now here's a high midge system. Okay. So what this indicates is that the carbon that's supporting the food web in these midge-influenced systems is coming from aquatic ecosystems. So terrestrial ecosystems are really being driven by aquatic carbon. Now, this has all been based on some broad-scale comparative studies looking at midge input as a function of distance from Mývatn, and also other surrounding lakes that have no or low midge emergence coming from them. None of these lakes have no midge emergences, but it's virtually nothing compared to what we see at Mývatn. We've also been doing some midge addition experiments, and so the idea here is to add dried midges to experimental plots This is not Lake Myvatn here. This is a low midge lake. So this environment is not heavily influenced by midges. And in some of these plots, dried midges are added to the system. And in some of these plots, they're reference plots so that no midges are added. And so the question is, to what extent do we see an increase in midges in this experimental setting? And so here's the results from the 2008 midge additions. This is a log response ratio on the y-axis, shown here as effect size. So this is actually kind of a log scale. So these are pretty strong effects. Here's total arthropods. We see a significant increase in response to midge additions. For these various detritivore taxa, again, midge additions see a pretty substantial increase. And for some of these parasite predators, we don't see much of a response. Just wanted to show you, too, some of these midge exclusion experiments that are ongoing. We have these big cages that are set out right next to Lake Myvatn, and midges are excluded from those. So the idea is to tease apart what sort of food web interactions are happening in these locations that are next to Mývatn, but we're not actually seeing midge inputs because we're keeping the midges out. So. All right, so to summarize, the Mývatn aspect of this, these emerging insects are a significant flux to terrestrial systems. At our study system, which we know has a lot of midges, that's why we went there. And for Lake Myvatn, there are some pretty far-reaching impacts. The impacts definitely are dramatic when we're talking about terrestrial plants. We're also looking at some terrestrial ecosystem processes like soil respiration and so on. But also arthropods and food webs are pretty strongly impacted by this flux of carbon and nutrients from the aquatic to the terrestrial. Now, how general is this? Is this something that might happen in other places, or is this something that's only going to happen in these really unique ecosystems like Mývatn, where we have 100,000 midges per meter squared in the benthos? Well, here's something that was in the news just last week from the National Weather Service. This actually got picked up by the local media. What this shows is a mayfly hatch on the Mississippi River, and it was caught on Doppler radar. So it basically looks like a gigantic storm to the Doppler radar. So the meteorologists probably freak out and say, oh my gosh, there's this massive storm right above the river. And in fact, it ends up being these massive insect hatches that get picked up. So this happens occasionally, and it often makes the news. So yes, insect hatches are important. The key factor to think about, first off, is proximity to water. For this to happen, land needs to be near water. So we used GIS to ask for the state of Wisconsin what fraction of the terrestrial landscape is adjacent to water. Now, Wisconsin is a pretty water-rich place, but I was surprised at how high these numbers were. About 9% of the state of Wisconsin occurs within 20 meters of water. Okay, so there's a lot of lakefront property here in the state. And 34% of the state occurs within 200 meters of water. So if we think that, maybe that effect of the aquatic productivity would drop off somewhere between 20 and 200 meters as a function of distance from shore, some reasonable fraction of our landscape is close to water. What we decided to do was estimate the insect flux from lake to land, and also do that same estimation for stream ecosystems to kind of get some sort of a basis for comparison, lakes versus streams. This has been studied quite a bit on stream ecosystems, and very few people have really looked at insect emergence impacts for lakes, so we thought that was kind of an interesting comparison. What we did, how we characterize flux, is that it's the amount of insect emergence per meter of shoreline. So how much aquatic insect emergence crosses that land-lake barrier onto the terrestrial system. So this is expressed as grams of carbon per meter of shore per year. So for a lake, it's pretty easy to estimate. We get the mean insect emergence, so that's grams per meter square per year. So that's the emergence rate. We multiply that by lake area, which gives us the total emergence from the lake. And then we just divide that by the perimeter of the lake. That tells us how much carbon is coming out of the lake per meter of shore. And we can easily do the same thing for streams. It's the emergence times 1/2 the stream width. That tells you how much insect is emerging from the stream ecosystem per meter of shore. And now we can compare these two. So we took empirical data from the literature on insect production and emergence from lakes and streams, and we conducted a numeric simulation that kind of looked to see how this flux from lake per meter of shore, flux from streams per meter of shore compared as a function of ecosystem area. So along the y-axis we have the flux. Along the x-axis we have ecosystem size, either the stream width or for lakes, the radius of the system. And first thing to note is that in both cases, they increase with ecosystem size. That's just basic ecosystem geometry. A larger system has more surface area per unit perimeter. Second thing is to note the effect of productivity in emergence. The dotted lines here represent 95% confidence intervals on the amount of flux for a given ecosystem size. So this is kind of the average, and then productivity varies from system to system, and that variability is captured in these dotted error bars. So we see this increasing trend. There's variability, and that's the variability in emergence. And then finally, the comparison of lakes and streams. What we find is that for a given ecosystem size, we see more flux for streams. Okay? And that's simply because streams, on average, tend to have a higher rate of insect emergence per unit area than lakes. But if you think about the surface area of your average stream versus the surface area of your average lake, there's a big difference there. A nice stream might be 4 meters in diameter, while in most lakes, if it's 4 meters in diameter, it's a little pond in your backyard. So most lakes are quite a bit bigger than streams in terms of surface area. So overall, the potential flux from lakes for lake ecosystems is quite a bit higher than for streams, just because lakes tend to be larger in areal extent. So the point here being that lakes can be a really important flux source of flux of carbon to land, and it's because they tend to be big ecosystems. All right. So I want to close off with just a few overall take-home points. First, to highlight the role of benthic production and pathways in lakes. The idea is hopefully that we are starting to incorporate a variety of pathways and processes, understanding how terrestrial and benthic pathways feed in as well. Second of all, that these benthic pathways can play an important role in coupling lakes and the surrounding landscape, and there can be some implications for terrestrial ecosystems. So far, that's mostly been demonstrated in places where there are really high rates of emergence for lakes, but of course there's been a lot of work done for stream ecosystems for that question. And finally, if we want to step back and think a little bit more generally, the magnitude of flux from aquatic systems to the surrounding landscape is something that I think we can get a handle on in a general sense. It's clearly a function of ecosystem geometry, and how large your system is determines to a great degree how much carbon could potentially leave, or how much nutrient can potentially leave to affect the surrounding landscape, and productivity is also a really key factor there as well. So with that, I'd like to say thank you.